We turn then this morning to the second half of the first chapter of Esther. In the first half of the chapter, we were introduced to a king called Xerxes. Xerxes proclaimed himself to be the king of kings. And the early verses of the chapter emphasize just how extensive his rule actually was. He was king over a huge empire with many, many different peoples and ethnic groups subject to him. And he calls a feast. The feast, we noted last time, was probably called because he was preparing for a major military war against Egypt, who were the only other power at the time who compared with his own Persian and Median empire. Be that as it may, he called this feast. It lasts for the best part of half a year, and at the end, after having displayed all the grandeur and power that he had, he was humiliated by a woman who was not prepared to be his property or his plaything. Now, how Xerxes reacts is going to mark the measure of the sort of person he is. At the end of our last study, we got to verse 12, and the signs are not good. The king became furious and burned with anger. And the result is described for us, at least the first part of what took place next, in the second half of Esther chapter 1. The story is told in a very matter-of-fact way. No interpretation is offered to us as to how we should understand it, except, of course, that if we have ears to hear and eyes to see, we cannot fail to notice that the story is told with very considerable irony. The story is told at the superficial level simply as it factually unfolded, but it's told in such a way that if we're alert, we realise that there is a great deal of sarcasm and irony in the way that the story is told. And Xerxes is exposed as what the modern world would call an egotist, what in popular parlance might be described as someone who is up themselves, or perhaps expressed in a different way, someone who is wholly self-obsessed. That's the character that is revealed in this second half of Esther chapter 1, and I want you to see how it's revealed and what it has to say. The person, first of all, I note with a wounded ego, the self-obsessed person who has been hurt in some way, will always try to find a way to escape personal responsibility. The king became furious and burned with anger at this slight by his queen, and so we're then told it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice. You see, the word sorry never occurred to Xerxes. It doesn't to people who are egotists. You must have met people like it, who simply cannot say the word sorry. I remember a colleague of mine once coming to me and saying, "Stephen, I have never heard you use the word sorry." And I thought, as he said it, well, I can think of at least 4 or 5 times when I've used that word, even though I didn't necessarily think I needed to. But I've never heard you say sorry in the face of some quite serious things that you had said and done to me and to others. That's the problem with people who are egotists. They never say sorry. In fact, they never even conceive of the possibility that they need to say sorry. And so rather than say sorry, Xerxes finds a way out of his problem. Of course, the minute it becomes a problem, you distance yourself from it, don't you? It's not something I need to deal with personally. It's something that has to be dealt with because it's a problem. And that's what happens in this chapter here. And as we are not surprised to discover, he resorted to the law. There is no suggestion actually that there was any such law. In fact, they had to invent one. And you will know that one of the first recourses of people who want to upset you or me for unjustified reasons is to get a solicitor to write a letter to threaten us. That's one of the common tactics of the modern world. We try to use other people who have a quasi-legal authority to write and to threaten us, to make the matter appear to be something that is an offence against the law. And that's what Xerxes does. In other words, he invents systems to deal with the problem person. He doesn't recognise that he is the problem person. An egotist will never recognise themselves as the problem. It is always the other person. In this case, Vashti. How dare she act in the way that she did? And then you'll notice that the person that we're talking about here, this egotist, needs hangers-on to support him or her, to stroke the ego, to offer the appropriate worship that the egotist wants. I remember once being at a meeting in which I challenged a person who was characterised by this sort of conduct, and he reacted so angrily that those who were with him literally had to stroke him to calm him down. This was a grown man in his 40s, in a senior role in a Christian organisation, but had to be stroked and calmed down because something had been said that pricked his own ego, and he had to find a way around it. And so we find that's exactly what happens here. This little inner cabinet, they know full well they're dependent upon the king for their position, and so it is that they give him the answers that he wants. They conduct themselves in a way that he desires. They feed his ego. They encourage him to take action against this woman who was completely right to act in the way that she did. And of course they find ways to place the blame elsewhere. The other thing I notice here is that people who are the hangers-on of egotists are themselves deeply flawed people. I think that the latter part of the chapter is really quite amusing, and I tried to make it amusing in the way that I read it. These people see threats everywhere. If others hear about what Vashti has done, then the whole realm, 50% of them at least, our wives, will be up in arms, and won't we be in trouble? So we need a law. The whole situation is ridiculous. I think we're meant to laugh as that part of the story is told. One of the women commentators I consulted in preparing for today made the observation that actually they are psychologically naive because they don't know how women tick. Women just don't react in this way generally, and actually neither do men normally, unless they're the sort of alpha males who are described here. There is not a sudden revolution planned overnight just simply because one lady at the other end of the empire in the capital has stood up against the king. It doesn't work that way. But these people are frightened that anything might undermine their own authority. They're terrified that such might happen to them. It's often said that sex, power and money are the things that control the world. And actually there's a lot of truth in that. The control of sex, power and money is the way in which many seek to control the world around them. And that's true in this story. There can be no place for a U-turn, no place for an apology. A wounded ego is cruel and vindictive and ready to crush the powerless. It's interesting that by the end of the chapter, Vashti is no longer referred to as queen. She's just Vashti. And at the stroke of a lawyer's pen, she's rubbed out the story. The problem's dealt with. for all the costs that would have brought to her in the way that she was treated. At the end of the chapter I found even funnier. Verses 21 and 22. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so they did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom. And did you notice the way in which you couldn't possibly not get a hearing to this particular statement? He sent dispatches to all the parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, to each people in its own language. Nobody's going to miss this. Proclaiming every man should be ruler over his own household. I mean, the thing's absurd. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. The thing about people who are egotists is they need self-publicity. They need people to know what they're doing. They need people to worship them. They're so self-absorbed that they have to be the centre of attention. They have to be in control. And yet, of course, you can imagine every woman in the kingdom, and most men as well, sniggering behind their hands. They had to do it behind their hands because otherwise they might be in trouble from the king. But sniggering behind their hands and just laughing at the absolute stupidity and idiocy of their king. I think most people who are egotists, if they only knew what people thought of them, they would be mortified. They wouldn't believe it. They wouldn't begin to understand that people are chuckling at them and thinking they're complete fools, because they're so self-absorbed themselves. In fact, as I say in the note, such people and their supporters are personally bankrupt. They're actually subhuman. They don't know life as it is created to be lived. They're strangers to the rule of love. And that's the tragedy about people like Xerxes. Unable to see beyond themselves, the experience of mutual respect, love, and the gentle rule of love is replaced by violence and coercion. So much of what we've seen over these last days is precisely that, isn't it? If people's hearts cannot be won, and they can't be, then folk have to resort to violence and to coercion in order to get the power and the authority that they crave. So what we learn in this chapter is all too uncomfortably true for many situations that we know today. And some of us, it's true for some very personal situations that we've been involved in. We know very much what is being described here. And if we don't personally, we are aware of those around us who do suffer at the hands of egotists. And we can look out in our world and read our news bulletins and whatever it is, and see that what is described here is all too true of so much that happens in our world. And yet, all too often it's true in the church, in Christian organisations. I've probably encountered more egotists in Christian organisations and churches than I have outside. Now that may reflect the fact that I spend most of my time with people who call themselves Christians, but it's nevertheless true. And of course it's true of all of us, actually. Deep down, it's a major problem for each one of us, because the first sin was the sin of self-assertion. You go back to the story in Genesis 3, and what's it all about? It is about human beings saying, we should be first. Forget about God, forget about what He wants us to do, we come first. And that's true of me, it's true of you, and it's true of our fallen world. That it's uncomfortably true that when we look at our own hearts, that what we see in Xerxes is also true of us. But my final word is this: He who was and is truly the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords is very, very different. And those who worship him are called to live in his likeness, not the likeness of the world around. If you've been following this week the readings in the church's lectionary, you will have read these words. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Those words effectively are the charter of the kingdom of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It's the constitution of him under whose citizenship we have claimed a place. And so we are called to reflect his humility. And though our egos may well have been humbled at the foot of the cross, yet the conduct that we're called to live is the conduct of the King. There's a story told in the New Testament, isn't there, of a group of Greek-speaking people who came to Philip and said to him, Philip, we would like to see Jesus. If we were to utter a short prayer this week, it might be just that. Sir, we would see Jesus. For when we see Jesus in all that he is and all that he's accomplished for us, we cannot be egotists. We cannot live like the world around us. We are called to live after him who is the gentle Jesus, who is meek and mild. Let's pray together. Our Father, in the light of the events of these last days, this is a solemn passage, but it's a reminder that at the heart of our world's experience, and at the heart of our own experience, indeed at the heart of our hearts, we acknowledge that self-assertion is such a huge problem. And so easily we fall into conducting ourselves in a way that are subhuman and simply do not reflect him whom we claim to serve. Help us, we pray. Show us Jesus. Reveal to us something of his glory. And as we join together in a few moments around his table, remind us of the cost of our redemption.